Hello, my name is Andrew Brooks. This is another presentation of Non-Linear Existentialism, titled Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance and Indoor Equality. Subtitle, Danger of Philosophy. The crux of this presentation is try to make a point through tying basically what appears on the surface, divergent or non sequitur ideas into one, and also kind of give it some background of my work, separation, integration, how important indoor equality or my work within indoor equality helped me lead to putting more substance, more framework, filling out my philosophy of non-linear existentialism and using other terms that have been used in philosophy, even though I try not to get too philosophical per se. I try to always ground it through existentialism. But quality and quantity are important concepts in philosophy that need to be discussed. And I use the work of Robert Pirsig in his Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance to hopefully make this point and also bring up what I believe is the danger of philosophy. We'll get to that later on. So the question I have to start the process and tie things together, I hope, is can the inherent but hidden dichotomy which appears to exist within the process of taking indoor equality measurements as framed between the context of nonlinear existentialism explain Robert Pirsig's hospitalization? For those who read the book, they understand that Mr. Pirsig apparently had electroconvulsive therapy because of a mental breakdown, which appears to be was catatonic. And through that, he seemed to have changed his personality. First things first is what I believe that there's an inherent misunderstanding about indoor equality. It is actually most of the time indoor quantity, meaning that we have an average belief, average parameters that we measure to discern whether or not the air is comfortable or safe for an individual. But again, the idea that through the process of generating this field, we've taken individuals' perceptions or what they believe is good or bad, their quality, and averaged it to have a quantity. Quality, to me, is their internal standard. Quantity is an averaged external standard. And a lot of conflict occurs because you go to one individual and you say, well, I'm measuring it. This is the range you should have. You're within the range. You should be perfectly okay. The problem is that they don't understand the difference between quality and quantity, and also they might not be measuring the right thing. The person is extremely interesting thing, if I can use that term. So there's more than just a few parameters, but there's also some underlining things, and this has happened to me. I've measured same day, same person, same building, and their reactions in the morning and the reactions in the afternoon to the same parameters are different. And I believe this occurs because of their internal quality standard and the one I cannot see, but it has changed maybe because of, and this has occurred through stress, through anxiety, through other things that have made their what they perceive as good or bad, what we believe quality is, change. So what do we have here at the beginning, and this has been brought up before, this is going through the idea of the difference between differential perception and referential knowledge. Differential perception is basically the ability to take in information from the outside. There's going to be basically a barrier between the inside and outside for an individual, and the surface upon which they entrain information or entrain energy from the outside, can they actually perceive it? And if they can perceive it, they're differentiating from other ones, so it allows them to entrain the information and start processing. And once it's processed within, it becomes referential knowledge. Now we have comparisons against. We have the ability to perceive it, and we start to differentiate it. And the other idea to know is that the more that's within the individual, the more it's going to be processed, the more it's going to change from the outside. Even in very linear systems, that you can discern the processing, that it's going to seem unstable unless you know what processes are actually occurring, what linear processes are occurring to the information. And for an individual human being, which I believe has a high level of, has incremental additive instability occurring, this can make it seem to more and more hard to understand and appears to be more unstable in comparison, of course, to differential perception. And as such, quantity as an external of the environment, including its media, relatively non-changing, stable standard that is used by an observer to measure objects' ideas against, as opposed to quality as an internal of the receiver, relatively changeable, unstable standard that is used by an observer to measure objects' ideas against. And the idea, again, I'm just bringing this one up to show that the relationship between quality, quantity, and stability, and is really hard to, as I mentioned in red here, an example of for a person would be predicting how they might describe themselves at two different times in the same day. And we all know that how good or bad you feel could be, even with the same information coming into yourself, could be perceived in two different ways. You can consider yourself better or worse. And we have the four permutations of quantity and quality against differential perception and referential knowledge. This is going to be if you have an external device that's measuring something. This is the sensors within yourself that allow you to sense things. This is where it gets a little bit different. Quantity referential knowledge. This is external to the individual and it's the averaged. So what are the social symbols that we use to be able to communicate with ourselves or define things? So social symbols would include words and language, but also, this is very important to note, social norms of beauty and truth. So what you believe beauty and truth is, as your internal state, is going to be, or could be very much so, different from the external. Cases where this might be pushed together, or there might be less separation between quality and quantity, is in political systems where people are basically brainwashed, where you will accept the quantity of the state as possible. And then what we have is, again, we have quality referential knowledge, personal views of beauty and truth. Now to the work. Zen in the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, published in 1974 about his trip with his son between Minnesota and California. And in what is discussed mostly in the book is views on life, his past mental illness, relationship with his son, and most importantly, his concept of quality. I underlined or highlight concept because he doesn't, I didn't see too many examples of it, try to flesh it out, as it were, if I can use that pun, of saying it is an actual thing of the individual. He always makes it something divorced from the individual. I think this caused him some issues. So we have, from discerning from the book and also going on the web, didn't want to go dive too deeply into it, but we had him, and he considered himself, he used the word Phaedrus, for who he was before his electroconvulsive therapy. He was a brilliant individual analytically, very linear, first year of university at the age of 15, and most importantly, he taught rhetoric in school, which is the art of writing, how to make writing good, so good or bad. So this is kind of where he started with the idea of quality. What is quality work and what is quality? So interesting. And I use the 2005 version of Zen in a Motorcycle, of Art of Motorcycle Repair as reference. Anytime that I cite a page, it's from that. So you can go back to it and look into which particular pages and what work I looked into. The ECT, again, this is from the book. He said it destroyed him. Phaedrus was no longer there, and it was basically him, the one that wrote this book. And the one who wrote writing and editing technical management is what I do for a living, and riding motorcycles. So he went from this very, very analytical person to a less analytical person. If you're writing editing technical manuals, you have to be quite analytical. But there was, I looked at the book and I tried to break it down into parts I understood and see the process of how things went along, the history of the book, history of the individual. The first part, I believe, is citing the problem. The second one, he he has two methods. He has a cautious method, I have in yellow, and a dangerous method, which I believe led to his illness. So we have the three parts, and I used color just to kind of separate. So the citation of the problem. Citation of the problem is that technology is overwhelming individuals. There's a schism between the individual and the technology it places upon itself. To me, it was basically the beginning of understanding that there's two different standards, internal standard and external standard. The internal standard would be the quality of the individual, and the external standard would be the quantity. And as we were able to more and more use math, engineering, and things to divide things up, be more analytical, there was more of a conflict between that being the external quantitative standard as opposed to the more movable, more uncertain standard of the individual. So that's where he started. He used motorcycle as kind of his beginning stage with this one, and his relationship with his good friends John and Sylvia Sutherland and what they thought. John was a drummer, or I think he's passed away, and of course that would lend itself to being more of a qualitative person, and how John Sutherland, interacted, and Robert saw that through his friend, because Robert was more analytical and was okay with the technology and felt more at ease with it, so he evidently had less of a conflict with it. Then he goes to classical romantic understanding, very similar to what I mentioned before. Then he gets into the indeterminacy of thought. And this is, I want to oppose to lateral knowledge. One, he's saying that it appears that he's claiming that thought is indeterminate, only indeterminate. And then the next one, he's saying lateral knowledge is a good thing. But to me, the instability that would be brought about indeterminacy of thought would allow to have lateral knowledge. So I underline this one just because I don't necessarily agree with this. And he's also saying in page 114 that it should be something that should be eliminated, that science eliminates the intermittency of thought. But a thought is inherently indeterminate. And it's not extremely indeterminate. Through my work, I've claimed that it's the instability that's brought about is incremental and additive, and it's only when a person gets into very conceptual ideas that it can become indeterminate. It isn't inherently very indeterminate, not indeterminate enough to begin with in the processing to be nonlinear. As you become more and more indeterminate, then it can become nonlinear. So one time he's claiming it's a bad thing, and another saying lateral knowledge is a good thing. The other thing that I have a problem with was time and space as concepts. He brings up a discussion with David Hume, saying that that we're all based on just experience, and has a problem with the causation, and basically brings up the idea of linearity. But then Kant comes back and says, well, yes, all of our experiences are based on senses, but because there has to be some underlying concepts there, such as time and space, we do change things, and that's kind of like the blank tablet of page 134. But these are discussed as concepts. However, if Pirsig was going the idea that we sense things, and sense things are coming in, and meaning things from the outside are coming into the individual, that's a physical process. So he doesn't ever discuss time and space as physical process, just as concepts. And that, to me, is a great problem, because you're making this an abstract process, not something that can actually link to a biological being. And as soon as you start separating the two, then you get into the abstractions and also the problems of infinite regression. And that, to me, is a great problem. Then he goes with the classic romantic compatibility. Completely agree with this one. Something that Stephen Jobs did a great job at, if I can use that pun. Where you take the quality and quantity and try to reduce the quality, the conflict between external and an internal standard. Then he goes into the idea of what the hell is quality. And in this one, he understands the ideas of good and bad, as it is for writing. But again, he goes, how do we come up with good and bad? And he tries to investigate that through a two-phase investigation. That's his methodology. So first, when he asked his class, because at this time he was teaching in Bozeman as rhetoric a professor in rhetoric, in English language, and he's asking what they think. And this, he doesn't realize what he's doing, sad as it is. He's actually differentiating between quality and quality, quantity and quality. He's asking his students what they think quality is. And that would be, what I think about it personally would be my quality. And what he does is to average it overall. He starts showing, well, this is, we know that there's difference between the individual and difference between what is good and what is bad. And this is what the classroom thinks, that is quantity. Here I'm using red because I think this is where it led to his mental illness and things that he wasn't really sure what he himself was doing. He wasn't able to step out enough of the process, look into it and say, well, this is what I'm doing. I think a lot of his analytical thinking, this is Feder's, a lot of analytical thinking made him blindsided to certain things. So at the top, he was asking himself, and one of the things he first comes up with is keep quality undefined. And he wanted to keep on quality undefined because he didn't want to overwhelm it with quantity. He didn't use the word quantity, but to define it. If you leave something undefined to him, then the analytical process, which he's extremely good at, can't cut it up, can't limit it. I think it's the idea of limited. He didn't like the idea of limiting what quality could be. Quality to him was this great thing, entity, which could not be limited, because if you don't limit it, then you don't reduce it. And these other points are kind of towards that. Quality, not a physical property and not measurable. So it's, to me, something, again, he's divorced it from who we are. So to him, if something is good, bad, things like that, those type of terms, that's quality. And they're not a real physical property. And they're not measurable. Again, this gets the idea of quality and quantity. I underline it because I don't really agree with that statement. Quality creates subject and object. Completely agree with, because if on my premise, my theory, that the instability within the frequency amplitude modulation V1B of the cerebral cortex produces incremental and additive instability, and then we have that. We have an object with low noise and basically a subject with high noise, and the noise within the individual allows them to separate from the environment. That noise, that instability, creates a sense of self. Well, you have the noise, you have the incongruency that noise it creates, and then you try to solve it. You try to mitigate it. So quality, or the instability that creates, and a proper way of saying it to me would be instability creates subject and object. The other thing, a limiting factor, and it shows his analytical thinking, is a priori analogs. He's kind of implying linearity here, or directly he implies linearity, is that he believes, and this is kind of very important actually, read directly from the text. So I'll basically do that. That he's saying that, let's just get to this one. In a sense, he said, that's Fedor's, it's the student's choice of quality that defines him. People differ about quality, not because quality is different, but because people are different in terms of experience. He speculated that if two people had identical a priori analogs, they would see quality identically every time. There was no way to test this, however, so it had to remain just speculation. So he's tying things directly to other things out from the outside. And that to me is that he's bringing in purely linear causation. I think that's because of his training being a very analytical thinker. And I think that also constricted him and didn't allow him to see a possible answer, that the quality and quantity are two different things and they are separated. Brings again the idea of harmony, completely agree with it, and he also brings up the wonderful statement about Mew and the truth trap of yes and no logic. Completely agree with this one. It goes to the idea of kind of a fuzzy logic, that there's nothing that's either yes or no, and yeah, that ties in directly with the idea of instability. So I agree with that, but he didn't kind of tie it in properly. It's the goal towards which method is aimed. 100% agree with that one. Mythos. This is kind of interesting. Mythos is the cultural norms, cultural experience that is brought forth, the person is aware of. Mythos leads to logos, logic. So mythos is kind of shared experiences, and when we try to quantify them, we start getting the logos. And so this is another underlying statement I disagree with, is that quality is a generator of mythos. Quality, I don't think, is the generator of mythos. Mythos is the average experience of a group of people. So again, it's a quantity, external thing. And it gets into your quantity versus quality, but again has a problem of fleshing out, because he gets, I think, caught up with the idea of things being extremely linear, and he can't see past that one. I think it starts causing him some concerns, some problems. So what we have here is, let me get into this one. This is what I meant. Reason and quality had become separated and in conflict with each other, and quality had been forced under and reason made supreme somewhere back then. He's getting into Greek philosophy, that he was getting in the idea that reason is kind of quantity and quality is person's own experience. And we're getting into the ideas of Greek philosophy and such, where they were trying to figure out what is truth and what is good. Originally, truth and good were the same thing, but then the cosmologists came along, and truth being the ultimate, that it was better than anything else. And so we started getting that problem. Then he goes back and forth back to the other one. Man is the measure of all things. Again, that I believe is true. Underline that. I've kind of emphasized that one. And then you get into moneists, that believing that there is one God, one truth, one thing, and everything is based on that. You can't use the truth, the one, to define other things, because it is everything. So we kind of got into that one. And then finally we're getting into the idea of kind of using his language in this one, where he's getting towards kind of his illness, that he was kind of saying that, again, this is the bottom of 402. The answer is maybe you got tired. Delivers as scathingly as possible, but it doesn't scathe. The chairman, this is the chairman of the committee for his PhD, is simply condemning Phaedrus, that which he has most fears in himself. As Haas goes on, Phaedrus sits staring at the window, feeling sorry for this old sheep herd and his classroom sheep and dogs, and sorry for himself that he will never be one. Then, when the bell rings, he leaves forever. So this is when we start. It's been building up and building up and building up about him trying to get the idea of quality and quantity. He doesn't understand he's saying quantity, but he is saying quantity, trying to figure out why they're different. And he just cannot do this because he's made some false assumptions beforehand that he can't see that they actually are two separate things, that the internal state can be linear to itself, the external state can be linear with themselves, but when the two try to interact with each other, there's that separation. He just doesn't seem to see that separation. He comes up with theoretical ideas for it, and many times he kind of like touches upon it, but he just doesn't see it. So at the end, basically when he does finally come very close to, or does go over the edge, as it were, that he just succumbs. His original goal was to keep quality undefined, but in the process of battling against the dialectics, he has made statements, and each statement has been a brick in a wall of definition he himself has been building around quality. So the organization of the reason itself defeats the quality. His own, in some ways he understands there has to be a separation, but his analytical nature does not allow him to do that. And because of that, this leads to a tremendous amount of incongruency with him himself. And ultimately, because an analytical individual would have a relatively lower amount of instability in comparison to one who's more of a creative individual, the rigidity within his own thought processes, I think, led to such a high amount of incongruency that it led to him having a mental breakdown. So if we have an overview, SAM quality, undefined entity without physical properties whose goal it is to harmonize. There's a lot of problems with that one. Then we got non-linear existentialism quality, the external standard of the observer as to what is desirable, good, and what is not desirable, bad in the short and long term. Individuals can see what's good for them in the short term and long term. A wise individual knows that something may appear to be bad or not desirable short term, losing weight, eating less money, to long-term benefits of health. It is the byproduct of the neuronal instability produced by FAM interacting and modifying the stable neuronal patterns to decrease the difference between non-optimal wants baseline activity level and primary needs baseline or activity level. So the goal is basically, because this is a system, energetics, that you try to reduce incongruencies between patterns to increase the overall sustainable level of neuronal activity within the cerebral cortex. Then you got nonlinear quantity, a developed external standard which is a byproduct of statistical manipulation of qualities of the individual. The goal is to average these qualities so that the majority of qualities are statistically consistent. So conclusion, answer hopefully. Can the inherent but hidden dichotomy, quality and quantity, which appears to exist within the indoor quality as framed within the context of nonlinear existentialism, explain Robert Pirsig's need for hospitalization? Yes. Mr. Pirsig's conceptual framework and underlying neuronal patterns that created and housed them were apparently overwhelmed due to the excessive incongruencies because his analytical linear thought patterns, quantity, were trying to solve a nonlinear question with linear assumptions. His obsessive nature compounded the situation. Ironically, and as an extension of my previous statement, I believe that some of his difficulties occurred because he did not have the right quality to handle high levels of abstraction. This is another thing that I have concern with when you come to philosophy. Again, the danger of philosophy is you have a lot of people that in order to understand, read, comprehend a lot of philosophy, you have to be quite analytical. You have to be able to take a lot of these information, try to discern the arguments and how they kind of connect with each other. And that lends, and then you sort of have to get into abstractions to try to mend the schism or to try to figure out the quality, how the two can interact. And I think for a lot of people, a lot of philosophers, that is in danger. I don't say all philosophers are going to have the difficulties and lead to mental illness. But the thing is that that's what I have a big problem with philosophy. It is too abstract. It is an abstraction that if an analytical person first started with the idea, the basic concept that we are not concepts and ideas, we're a physical being, and move on from that. But somehow they jump directly to the idea that, well, that's assumed, whatever, and you go directly to the concepts and ideas. And I think that is a huge problem, that man is man, woman is woman, a person is a person, flesh and blood. And we move on from that beginning idea. And if you don't understand that, it's going to lead to a lot of problems. And in conclusion, as it pertains to indoor air quality and indoor air quality assessment, in indoor air quality assessments, conflict occurs when the technologist does not know which standard he is testing against, and that's 100%. You want to upset someone, you go in there, test their space, and if you don't understand that actually what you're comparing the person against is a quantity, then you're going to upset that person. If you don't understand the fullness of the individual, like if you use your eyes, ears, understand this person might be in an excited or depressed state, and that might affect their perception of the environment, it's going to be a big problem. If you have any questions, please contact me. Hopefully I've added something to the understanding of how indoor air quality is actually indoor air quantity. Well, if you're not doing it right, and then hopefully it would become indoor air quality. And also appreciate some of the things that were brought up for Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. Good work. I thought he brought up a lot of good ideas. I just wish he fleshed out the individual to what they actually are and was open to things apparently not being linear on the first. I mean, it's okay through analysis understand that something is nonlinear, but when you become obsessed about it, then everything appears in the fashion that you want it to be, and you don't have the flexibility in your thoughts to step out of it. I thank you very, very much for your time, and take care.